When I first met Grace, I was 24 and working my first big job in software development at a mid-sized firm in Seattle. She was 22, fresh out of college, and full of energy as a sales consultant. From the moment I saw her, I was hooked. Grace was sharp, quick-witted, and had this spark about her that drew everyone in. Over the years, that spark became my anchor. We got married after 3 years of dating, and for a while, life felt like a dream. Fast forward 9 years, and I was convinced we had built a solid life together. We'd settled into the rhythms of marriage, early mornings with coffee, evenings watching our favorite shows, and weekends filled with either lazy brunches or trips to visit family. Grace always had this knack for making life feel just a little more vibrant, even in the mundane. She was the kind of person who could turn a grocery store run into a fun adventure. Of course, like any couple, we had our ups and downs. There were arguments about finances, differing opinions on how to spend holidays, and the occasional moments where we'd snap at each other after a long day. But overall, I thought we were happy. I mean, isn't that what marriage is about? Rolling with the punches, finding comfort in the familiar, and supporting each other through thick and thin. Things started to shift subtly about 6 months ago. Grace began working longer hours, claiming her company was in the middle of a major restructuring. At first, I didn't think much of it. She was ambitious and dedicated to her job, traits I'd always admired. But then there were little things, missed dinners, distracted conversations, and her newfound obsession with her phone. She'd always been private about her messages, but now her phone seemed glued to her hand, and her screen would always dim when I got near. It wasn't until last Tuesday that everything began to unravel. It was a typical weekday. I had just finished my last work meeting and headed to the living room to decompress when I saw a small package sitting on the coffee table. It was one of those plain brown parcels with no distinct markings, the kind you see everywhere these days. The only thing that stood out was the lack of a sender's name. It was addressed to Grace, and the handwriting on the label wasn't familiar. When Grace walked in that evening and spotted the package, her reaction was strange. She froze for a second, her expression a mix of surprise and something else I couldn't quite place. Then she rushed over, grabbed the box, and muttered something about it being work-related. Before I could even ask what it was, she had whisked it away to the bedroom and shut the door. I shrugged it off at first, figuring it was some kind of promotional item or a sample from a client. But as the night wore on, her behavior grew even odder. She avoided eye contact, and when I asked about her day, her answers were short and clipped. By the time we went to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Lying there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, I replayed the scene in my head. Grace wasn't one to get rattled easily, and her reaction to the package was anything but typical. That was the first crack in the foundation of what I thought was a solid marriage. I told myself I was probably overthinking things, but deep down, a nagging voice whispered that there was more to this story than she was letting on. The following day, the memory of Grace's reaction to the package lingered in my mind like a song you can't shake. I tried to focus on work, diving into debugging lines of code and responding to client emails, but every now and then, my thoughts drifted back to that brown box and Grace's uncharacteristic behavior. It wasn't like her to be secretive. In fact, one of the things I had always loved about her was how open and straightforward she was, or at least, how I thought she was. That evening, I decided to casually bring it up. We were sitting at the kitchen table, eating the takeout I'd picked up on my way home, and I said, "Hey, what was in that package yesterday? It seemed like you were in a hurry to open it." Grace didn't even look up from her food. "Oh, nothing important. Just some stuff from work." Her tone was dismissive, almost rehearsed, like she'd been preparing for the question. I pressed a little further. "What kind of work stuff? Samples or something?" She finally looked up, her face betraying a flicker of annoyance. "Yeah, just samples. You know how clients send over things sometimes. Why are you so interested?" She tried to laugh it off, but it felt forced, and her eyes darted away before landing back on her plate. Her defensiveness caught me off guard. Normally, Grace loved talking about her work. She would come home and vent about difficult clients or gush about closing a big sale. Now, she was acting like the topic was radioactive. Something about it didn't sit right with me. Later that night, as I was cleaning up the dishes, I noticed her phone sitting on the counter. Grace was in the bathroom, and for a moment, I considered picking it up and checking her messages. But the thought made me feel queasy. Trust was the foundation of our relationship, wasn't it? Snooping would mean admitting I doubted her, and that wasn't a line I was ready to cross, at least, not yet. Instead, I decided to let it go, hoping I was just imagining things. But Grace wasn't making it easy. Over the next few days, her behavior grew more erratic. She started taking calls in the other room, lowering her voice whenever I walked by. She'd laugh at texts, then quickly lock her phone when I glanced over. And then there was the package itself. She'd hidden it somewhere. I didn't see it in the kitchen, the living room, or our shared closet. It was as though the thing had vanished into thin air. Part of me wanted to believe her explanation, but another part couldn't ignore the alarm bells going off in my head. The final straw came on Friday evening. Grace had been unusually quiet all day, claiming she was tired from work. After dinner, she said she needed to run out and grab something from the store. It wasn't unusual for her to make late runs for snacks or toiletries, so I didn't think much of it, until I saw her leave the house without her purse. I watched from the window as she walked to her car, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She got in, started the engine, and sat there for a moment before driving off. My stomach churned as I stood there, staring at the empty driveway. Something was definitely wrong, and I was done pretending otherwise. That night, as I lay in bed, I made a decision. If Grace wasn't going to tell me what was going on, I'd have to find out myself. The next day, Grace left for work early, which wasn't unusual given her recent schedule. As soon as I heard her car pull out of the driveway, I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I hated the idea of snooping through her things. It felt like a betrayal of the very trust one was trying to protect. But the way she'd been acting, the way she clung to secrecy, left me with little choice. I started my search in the bedroom, figuring that if she had hidden the package somewhere, it was likely close by. At first, I didn't find anything. The closet was packed with her neatly arranged clothes, and the drawers in the nightstand were filled with the usual items, books, chargers, a random collection of receipts. Then I opened the bottom drawer of her dresser. Beneath a stack of folded workout clothes, I spotted it, the plain brown package from a few days ago. My hands trembled as I pulled it out. It looked untouched, the tape still intact. There was no sender information on the label, just her name and our address written in that unfamiliar handwriting. For a moment, I just stared at it, debating whether to open it. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it really was work-related, some harmless item that had nothing to do with the growing distance between us. But the gnawing suspicion in my gut wouldn't let me put it back. Whatever was inside, I needed to know. I carefully peeled the tape back, trying to keep the packaging as intact as possible. When I lifted the flaps, my stomach dropped. Inside was a small, elegant box tied with a red ribbon. It looked like the kind of box you'd see in a high-end jewelry store. I opened it with shaking hands and found a delicate bracelet, studded with what looked like tiny diamonds. There was no note, no receipt, just the bracelet. My mind scrambled to make sense of it. Grace had never mentioned buying jewelry, and we didn't have any upcoming anniversaries or special occasions that would warrant such a gift. And then, a chilling thought hit me, what if this wasn't something she'd bought, but something someone had given her? I sat there, the bracelet heavy in my hands, as the room seemed to spin around me. The gift didn't feel like something a colleague or client would send, it felt personal, intimate. My chest tightened as I thought back to all the recent changes in her behavior. The late nights, the secretive texts, the defensive way she'd acted about the package. It all started to fall into place, and I didn't like the picture it was painting. I put the bracelet back in its box and carefully resealed the package, returning it to its hiding spot. My thoughts were a chaotic swirl of anger, confusion, and hurt. I told myself I couldn't jump to conclusions, but deep down, I already knew what this meant. Grace was hiding something, or someone, and it was only a matter of time before I uncovered the truth. For the rest of the day, I went through the motions in a haze. I answered emails, worked on a project, and even managed to force down some lunch, but my mind kept circling back to the package. By the time Grace came home that evening, I'd resolved to take the next step. If the bracelet was a clue, there had to be more. And I was going to find it. After my discovery of the bracelet, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more Grace was hiding. I hated the paranoia that had taken root in my mind, but the thought of sitting back and doing nothing felt even worse. If she was keeping secrets, I needed to know the full truth. The following evening, Grace announced that she'd be working late again. Her explanation felt rehearsed, her tone oddly casual given how tense she'd been lately. I nodded and said all the right things, don't work too hard, and drive safe, but inside, my thoughts were racing. Her absence was the perfect opportunity to dig deeper. As soon as her car disappeared down the street, I headed to the one place I hadn't checked yet, her home office. Grace rarely used it these days, preferring to work on her laptop in the living room or at the kitchen table. But something told me I might find answers there. The room was neat, almost too neat, as though she'd recently tidied it up. I started with her desk, rifling through the drawers and sorting through the contents. Most of what I found seemed innocuous: pens, sticky notes, client files, but in the bottom drawer, I found her personal laptop. She hadn't used it in months, preferring her work-issued one, but it was worth a shot. I opened the laptop and booted it up, surprised that it wasn't password protected. My heart pounded as I navigated to her email. At first, everything looked normal: work messages, promotional offers, reminders about bills. But then I noticed a folder marked personal that I hadn't seen before. Inside, I found a series of emails that made my blood run cold. They were between Grace and someone named Elliot. The messages weren't explicit, but the tone was undeniably intimate. He referred to her as babe and beautiful, and she responded with playful, flirty comments. My stomach churned as I read through the exchange, each email feeling like a punch to the gut. One email, dated 2 weeks ago, stood out. Elliot. I can't wait to see you again. The bracelet is just a small token to remind you how much you mean to me. Grace. You're too sweet. I love it, and you. Can't wait either. 2 hearts. I stared at the screen, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. The bracelet wasn't just a gift, it was proof of an affair. Grace wasn't just hiding something, she was living a double life. I kept scrolling, hoping against hope that there was some explanation that would make this all make sense. But the more I read, the clearer it became: Grace was seeing this Elliot guy behind my back, and it wasn't just a fling. Their messages were filled with plans, shared jokes, and references to moments I hadn't been a part of. I slammed the laptop shut and sat back, the weight of the discovery pressing down on me. I felt like I couldn't breathe, my chest tight with a mix of anger, betrayal, and sadness. The woman I'd spent 9 years building a life with, the person I thought I knew better than anyone, had been lying to me. I couldn't decide what hurt more, the fact that she was cheating, or the realization that she'd been so good at hiding it. That night, I barely slept. My mind was a storm of emotions: anger, confusion, humiliation, and sadness. I kept replaying the emails in my head, imagining Grace typing those messages, laughing at Elliot's jokes, and wearing that bracelet as a symbol of their relationship. Each thought felt like a dagger to the chest. By morning, I knew I couldn't let this fester. I had to confront her, no matter how painful it would be. There was no way I could keep pretending everything was normal while this knowledge ate away at me. I didn't have a clear plan, but I knew one thing: I needed answers, and I deserved the truth. When Grace walked through the door that evening, she seemed upbeat, even cheerful. She kissed me on the cheek, dropped her purse on the counter, and asked how my day was. The sight of her acting so normal, so oblivious to the storm brewing inside me, made my blood boil. I tried to keep my tone steady. Can we talk? I asked. She paused, looking at me with mild concern. Sure. What's up? I gestured toward the living room, and we sat down on opposite ends of the couch. I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words to start. But there was no gentle way to ease into this. I found the bracelet, I said, my voice colder than I intended. Her smile faltered, and her eyes darted toward the bedroom for a split second before returning to me. What bracelet? She asked, feigning confusion. The one that came in that package last week, I said. The one you said was work-related. Only it wasn't, was it? Grace's face went pale. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. I pressed on, my anger breaking through the surface. I opened the package, Grace. I saw the bracelet. And then I saw the emails. Her eyes widened, and she sank back against the couch. You went through my laptop, she said, her voice rising, as if that were the real betrayal. Don't turn this on me, I snapped. I wouldn't have needed to if you hadn't been hiding things. So why don't you just tell me the truth? Who is Elliot? Her expression shifted from shock to something else, fear, maybe. Regret? She didn't answer right away, and the silence between us stretched out like an open wound. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. He's someone I met at work. A client. I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in my ears. A client? That's what you're calling him? The guy who sends you expensive jewelry and signs his emails with "I love you"? Grace winced, as if the words physically hurt her. It wasn't supposed to go this far, she said. It started out as nothing. Just talking. But then. I don't know, things got complicated. Complicated? I said, my voice rising. You lied to me. You cheated on me. How is that complicated? It's pretty damn simple from where I'm standing. Tears filled her eyes, and she reached for my hand, but I pulled away. I'm sorry, Robert, she said, her voice trembling. I never meant to hurt you. Then why did you do it? I demanded. Was I not enough for you? Was our marriage just some convenience while you chased after this guy? Her tears fell freely now, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her. I was too consumed by my own pain. She started to speak, but I cut her off. Save it, I said. I need some time to think. With that, I stood and left the room, my chest tight and my hands shaking. I didn't look back as I walked down the hall, feeling like the life I'd known had just crumbled into pieces. I spent the night in the guest room, though calling it sleeping would be generous. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying Grace's words over and over. It wasn't supposed to go this far. What did that even mean? Was it some kind of excuse? An attempt to downplay the betrayal? No matter how I tried to rationalize it, nothing made sense. All I knew was that the woman I had trusted with my heart had shattered it into a million pieces. When I finally got up in the morning, the house was eerily quiet. Grace must have already left for work, or maybe she was avoiding me. Either way, I was grateful for the solitude. I needed time to process everything, to decide what I was going to do next. I made coffee but couldn't bring myself to drink it. My appetite was non-existent, my stomach knotted with anxiety and anger. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window as the events of the past few days replayed in my mind. Part of me wanted to forgive Grace, to believe that this was just a terrible mistake and that we could somehow move past it. But the other part, the louder, angrier part, knew that trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to repair. Every time I thought about her sneaking around, exchanging messages with Elliot, and accepting gifts from him, I felt sick to my core. Around noon, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Grace. Grace. I'm so sorry, Robert. I know I messed up, and I hate myself for hurting you. Can we please talk tonight? I want to explain everything. I stared at the message for a long time, debating whether to respond. What was there to talk about? She'd already admitted to the affair. What more could she possibly say that would make any of this better? In the end, I didn't reply. I wasn't ready to hear more excuses or justifications. Instead, I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself, cleaning, organizing, even going for a run. But no matter what I did, the pain lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. When Grace came home that evening, I was in the living room, pretending to watch TV. She hesitated in the doorway, her face a mix of guilt and sadness. "Robert," she said softly, her voice cracking. "Can we please talk?" I didn't look at her. "Go ahead," I said flatly. She sat down on the edge of the couch, wringing her hands. "I'm so sorry," she began. "I know I've hurt you in ways I can never take back, but I need you to know that I love you. This thing with Elliot, it was a mistake. A stupid, selfish mistake." I turned to her, my expression hard. "A mistake?" I said. "Mistakes are accidental. What you did took planning. You built an entire relationship with him behind my back. That's not a mistake, that's a choice." She flinched, tears streaming down her face. "You're right," she said. "I don't have any excuses. I was lonely, and I felt, I don't know, disconnected from us. Elliot made me feel wanted, like I was special again. But it wasn't real. It was just an escape." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Disconnected? Was she saying this was my fault? That I hadn't done enough to make her feel valued? I opened my mouth to respond but closed it again, the words sticking in my throat. Grace continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I ended it with him weeks ago. I swear. I realized what I was doing was wrong, and I wanted to fix things with you. That's why I kept the bracelet. I didn't want you to find out and think it meant more than it did." I laughed bitterly. "Well, congratulations. Your plan worked perfectly. I definitely don't think it meant anything." She sobbed quietly, her hands trembling as she wiped her face. "Please, Robert," she said. "Give me a chance to make this right. I'll do whatever it takes." I looked at her, searching for some sign of the woman I'd fallen in love with. But all I saw was someone I barely recognized. "I don't know if I can," I said finally. "You didn't just hurt me, Grace. You destroyed the trust that held us together. And without trust, what's left?" Her tears came harder, but I didn't stay to watch. I stood and walked out of the room, my heart heavy with the weight of a decision I wasn't ready to make. The days that followed were a blur of tension and awkwardness. Grace seemed desperate to prove herself, going out of her way to be attentive and affectionate. She'd make my favorite meals, ask about my day, and offer to help with things she'd usually leave to me, like organizing bills or taking out the trash. But every gesture felt hollow, like a bandage over a wound that was too deep to heal. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to try, if only for the 9 years we'd spent building a life together. I thought about the good times, the laughter, the shared dreams, the moments that made me believe we were unshakable. But then I'd remember the emails, the bracelet, and the way she'd lied to my face. The anger would rise up all over again, making it impossible to even look at her without feeling betrayed. We agreed to try counseling, though the decision felt more like going through the motions than a real step toward healing. Our first session was awkward and stilted, the air thick with unspoken resentment. Grace apologized again, this time in front of the therapist, and talked about how lonely she'd been. She admitted that she'd felt neglected, like I was more focused on work than on her. Hearing her say that stung. I'd always prided myself on being a supportive husband, someone who worked hard to provide for our life together. But now she was saying that wasn't enough. "I felt invisible," she said, her voice trembling. "And Elliot, he made me feel seen." The therapist gently suggested that we both needed to communicate better, that Grace should have voiced her feelings instead of seeking validation elsewhere. I agreed with that in theory, but it didn't make the betrayal any easier to stomach. Grace's tears and promises to do better didn't erase the fact that she'd chosen to step outside our marriage rather than fight for it. Despite my reservations, I tried to make an effort. I listened when she talked about her day, even though it felt forced. I went out of my way to be present during meals, even when all I wanted to do was retreat to the safety of the guest room. Grace seemed encouraged by these small gestures, but for me, they were just that, small. The truth was, every moment spent with her felt like walking on shattered glass. Then, one evening, I found myself alone in the house. Grace had gone to meet a friend for coffee, and I was scrolling mindlessly through my phone when an email notification popped up on my laptop. It was from our counselor, confirming the details of our next session. I clicked on it out of habit, and when I went to close the browser, I saw Grace's email account still logged in. For a moment, I stared at the screen, torn between curiosity and guilt. She'd promised that the affair was over, that she'd cut off all contact with Elliot. But could I trust her? Or was I just setting myself up to be blindsided again? My hand hovered over the mouse, my heart pounding. I told myself I was only looking to confirm what she'd already said, to reassure myself that she was truly committed to fixing things. But deep down, I knew I was looking for more. Some proof that my lingering doubts weren't just paranoia. I clicked on her inbox and started scrolling. Most of the recent emails were mundane, work messages, promotional offers, and a couple of forwards from her sister. But then I spotted one, buried in a folder labeled Archive. It was from Elliot. Dated 2 days ago. The subject line read, "Thinking of you." I clicked on it, my hands trembling. The email was short but devastating. Elliot. I miss you. I know you said this had to end, but I can't stop thinking about you. Please, Grace, just one more chance to see you. You mean too much to me to let go this easily. My stomach churned as I stared at the screen. She hadn't responded, at least not in the email thread I was looking at. But the fact that he felt comfortable reaching out again told me everything I needed to know. Whatever closure she'd claimed to have wasn't as final as she'd made it seem. I slammed the laptop shut, my chest heaving. All the progress we'd supposedly made over the past few days felt like a cruel joke. Grace had been stringing me along, pretending to rebuild our marriage while keeping the door open for him. When Grace walked through the door later that night, cheerful and chatty from her outing, I didn't say a word. But inside, I felt the last shred of hope I'd been clinging to crumble into dust. The discovery of Elliot's email replayed in my mind like a broken record. Every time I thought about it, my anger and hurt deepened. Grace had lied again, this time not by omission, but through her promise that the affair was over. Clearly, it wasn't. Whether or not she'd responded to his message, the fact that he still felt comfortable contacting her was proof that their connection hadn't been severed as she claimed. For the next 2 days, I avoided Grace as much as possible. She noticed, of course, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I'd found. I needed time to process it, to decide my next move. Was this the final straw? Could I confront her again, knowing she'd probably have another set of excuses lined up? Or was I just prolonging the inevitable? On the third night after my discovery, I made my decision. Grace came home from work around 6, looking tired but upbeat. She set her purse on the counter and greeted me with a soft smile. "Hey, how was your day?" she asked, her voice tentative. She'd been walking on eggshells around me since the first confrontation, clearly trying to gauge my mood before making any moves. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I stood from the couch and gestured toward the kitchen table. "We need to talk," I said, my tone clipped. Her face fell. "Okay," she said, sitting down across from me. "What's going on?" I didn't bother with preamble. "Elliot emailed you," I said. 2 days ago." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked genuinely shocked. But then her expression shifted to something more defensive. "Robert, I didn't respond," she said quickly. "I swear. I told him it was over, and I haven't." "Stop," I interrupted, holding up a hand. Just stop. I don't care if you responded or not. The point is, he felt comfortable enough to reach out to you again. You clearly didn't end things as cleanly as you claimed. Grace opened her mouth to protest, but I didn't give her the chance. This isn't about what you did or didn't say in response. This is about the fact that you lied to me. Again. You told me it was over, and you sat there in counseling, promising to rebuild our marriage, while you clearly left the door open for him. Her face crumpled, and she buried her head in her hands. I didn't mean to, she said, her voice muffled. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought if I just ignored him, he'd go away, and we could move on. I slammed my hand down on the table, startling her. Ignoring him isn't ending it, Grace. I shouted. Do you have any idea what this has done to me? To us? You've completely destroyed my trust in you, and instead of doing everything you can to fix it, you've been playing games. Pretending to be all in while keeping him on the back burner. Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head. It's not like that, she pleaded. I don't want him, Robert. I want you. I've been trying so hard to show you that. I laughed bitterly. Trying? By lying? By keeping secrets? That's not trying, Grace. That's manipulation. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Grace wiped her eyes and looked up at me, her face a mixture of guilt and desperation. What do you want me to do? She asked softly. Tell me, and I'll do it. I'll block him, I'll change my number, I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm committed to us. Her words sounded sincere, but they fell flat. I'd heard similar promises before, and they'd meant nothing. This time, I wasn't willing to be strung along. You don't get it, do you? I said, my voice low and steady. It's not about what you do now. It's about what you've already done. You've shattered everything we built together, and no amount of promises or gestures is going to undo that. She sobbed quietly, her shoulders shaking, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. I felt too raw, too hollowed out by the weight of her betrayal. Finally, I stood and walked to the door. I need space, I said, grabbing my coat. Don't wait up. Without giving her a chance to respond, I walked out, the cold night air biting against my skin. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house. Not with her. Not after everything. I drove aimlessly for hours that night, the city lights blurring into streaks as I navigated empty streets. My thoughts were a chaotic mess, flipping between anger, sadness, and a strange numbness that crept in whenever I felt too overwhelmed. It was as if my mind was trying to protect itself, shutting down parts of me that couldn't take any more pain. I finally ended up at a small diner on the outskirts of town. It was one of those places that stayed open 24/7, catering to night owls and insomniacs. I ordered a coffee and sat in the corner booth, staring at the steaming cup as if it held answers to questions I hadn't even figured out how to ask. What was I supposed to do now? Grace's betrayal had cut so deeply that I couldn't see a path forward. Counseling had felt like a lifeline, a way to mend the broken pieces, but now it seemed like a joke. She'd been lying even then, pretending to want the same things while keeping secrets. How could I trust anything she said or did from here on out? A part of me wondered if I'd missed something, some sign earlier in our marriage that things weren't as perfect as I'd thought. Had I been too wrapped up in my work? Too complacent? Grace had said she felt neglected, and while that didn't excuse her choices, it made me question whether I could have done more to prevent all this. But even if I had fallen short in some ways, didn't she owe it to me to talk about it? To fight for us instead of turning to someone else? I stayed at the diner until well past midnight, sipping my coffee and staring out the window at the darkened streets. The idea of going home filled me with dread. I wasn't ready to face Grace again, to hear more apologies or promises that she couldn't possibly keep. Eventually, I pulled out my phone and called my older brother, Mark. Mark was one of the few people I trusted completely. He'd always been a steady presence in my life, someone who could see things clearly when I couldn't. When he answered, his voice groggy, I apologized for waking him up but explained that I needed to talk. "What's going on, Rob?" he asked, instantly awake. I hesitated for a moment, then told him everything. The package, the emails, the counseling, and Elliot's latest message. By the time I finished, my voice was shaking, and I felt like I'd just run a marathon. "Jesus," Mark said after a long pause. "I'm so sorry, man. That's brutal." "Yeah," I said, my voice hollow. "I don't know what to do. Part of me wants to walk away, but then I think about everything we've been through together, and it feels impossible." Mark was quiet for a moment, then said, "Look, I can't tell you what to do. Only you can decide whether this is something you can move past. But I will say this, trust is the foundation of any relationship. If that's gone, what's left?" His words hit me hard because they echoed what I'd already been thinking. Without trust, our marriage was nothing more than a shell, a facade of what it used to be. "If you need a place to crash for a while, you're always welcome here," Mark added. "No pressure, but it might help to get some space, clear your head." I thanked him and hung up, feeling a little lighter for the first time in days. Maybe space was exactly what I needed. Staying in the same house with Grace, pretending like we could fix this, was only making things worse. When I finally went home, the house was dark and quiet. Grace was already in bed, or at least pretending to be. I didn't bother checking. I went straight to the guest room, closed the door, and collapsed onto the bed. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I made my decision. I couldn't keep living in limbo, caught between the life I thought I had and the reality of Grace's betrayal. Tomorrow, I'd tell her I needed time apart. Whether that meant days, weeks, or forever, I didn't know. But one thing was clear, I couldn't begin to heal until I put some distance between us. The next morning, I woke up feeling hollow but resolute. My decision to put distance between Grace and me felt like the first clear step I'd taken since this nightmare began. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew staying in the house, pretending we could fix things overnight, was no longer an option. When I walked into the kitchen, Grace was already there, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red and puffy from what I assumed was another night of crying. "Morning," she said hesitantly. "Morning," I replied, my voice flat. I grabbed a mug and poured myself some coffee, feeling her eyes on me the entire time. "Did you sleep okay?" she asked, clearly trying to gauge my mood. I set the mug down and turned to face her. "We need to talk." Her face fell, and she nodded, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Okay," she said softly. I sat across from her, the tension in the air so thick it was almost suffocating. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened," I began. "About us, about the betrayal, about what's left of our marriage. And I've come to the conclusion that I can't keep doing this, not like this." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't say anything, waiting for me to continue. "I need space, Grace," I said firmly. "I need time away from you, from this house, from everything, to figure out what I really want and whether I can ever trust you again." She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Robert, please," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I've hurt you, and I know I've made so many mistakes, but we can work through this. I love you, and I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Just, don't leave." I shook my head. "It's not about what you want anymore, Grace. It's about what I need. And right now, I need time and distance to think clearly. Staying here, pretending we're okay, is only making things worse." She broke down, sobbing into her hands. Watching her cry should have tugged at my heartstrings, but instead, I felt a strange sense of detachment. It was as if the part of me that cared had been dulled by the weight of everything she'd done. "I'll be staying at Mark's for a while," I continued. "I don't know how long, but I'll let you know when I'm ready to talk again." Grace looked up, her face streaked with tears. "What if you decide you don't want to come back?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer for her. The truth was, I didn't know. Part of me still clung to the hope that we could salvage something from the wreckage, but another part, the part that had been growing louder with each passing day, knew that some things were too broken to fix. I don't know, I admitted. But I can't make that decision here, with all of this hanging over me. She nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I'll give you the space you need, she said quietly. But please, don't give up on us completely. I didn't respond. Instead, I stood, grabbed my coffee, and headed back to the guest room to pack a bag. As I stuffed clothes and toiletries into my duffel, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Leaving felt like giving up, but staying felt like torture. This was the only choice that made sense. A couple of hours later, I pulled into Mark's driveway. He greeted me at the door with a firm handshake and a sympathetic smile. "You're doing the right thing," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. I wasn't so sure, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. Mark showed me to the spare room, and as I unpacked, I thought about the road ahead. The fallout of Grace's betrayal had left a gaping hole in my life, and I wasn't sure how, or if, I could ever fill it. But one thing was certain, I was done pretending that everything was okay. Whether our marriage could be saved or not, I needed to find myself again, apart from Grace and the weight of her choices. Only then could I begin to move forward, whatever that might look like. The first few days at Mark's place were tough. I didn't realize how much of my identity had been tied to my life with Grace until I was alone, staring at the walls of a guest room that wasn't mine. The silence felt oppressive, but it also forced me to confront everything I'd been avoiding, the anger, the sadness, and the deep sense of betrayal. Mark gave me space when I needed it but was always there to talk when I felt ready. He was a steady presence, offering advice without pushing too hard. "This kind of pain doesn't go away overnight," he said one evening as we sat on his back porch, nursing beers. "But it won't last forever, either. You've got to let yourself feel it, work through it, and eventually, you'll come out the other side." I wanted to believe him, but it was hard to imagine a future where the ache in my chest didn't dominate my every thought. Still, I took his words to heart and started focusing on the small things I could control. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects to keep my mind occupied. I started running again, rediscovering the joy of pounding the pavement and letting my thoughts drift. And, perhaps most importantly, I began leaning on the people who cared about me, Mark, my parents, and a few close friends who reached out when they heard about the separation. During this time, Grace sent me several texts and emails. At first, they were long, emotional pleas for forgiveness. She wrote about how much she missed me, how deeply she regretted what she'd done, and how she was willing to do whatever it took to fix our marriage. Her words were heartfelt, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. As the days turned into weeks, her messages grew shorter and less frequent. Eventually, they stopped altogether. I wasn't sure whether that was a sign she'd given up or was simply respecting my request for space, but either way, I was grateful for the reprieve. It wasn't until a month after I left that I finally allowed myself to reflect on the bigger picture. Grace's betrayal had been devastating, but it also forced me to take a hard look at myself and our relationship. I realized that I'd been so focused on my work and routines that I hadn't noticed how much distance had crept into our marriage. I wasn't excusing her actions, nothing justified what she'd done, but I could see now how both of us had let things slide in ways that left her vulnerable to someone like Elliot. That realization didn't make the pain go away, but it gave me a sense of clarity. I started journaling, pouring my thoughts onto the page in an attempt to untangle the mess of emotions inside me. I wrote about the good times with Grace, the betrayal, and the uncertainty of the future. Over time, those pages became a roadmap for my healing, helping me process everything in a way that felt manageable. One day, about 6 weeks after I'd left, I found myself sitting in Mark's living room with my laptop open. I stared at Grace's last email, which had been sitting unread in my inbox for days. Finally, I clicked on it. Grace. Robert. I know you asked for space, and I've been trying to respect that. But I want you to know that I'm still here, waiting for the chance to make things right. I've started therapy on my own, and it's helped me see how much I took you for granted and how deeply I've hurt you. I don't expect you to forgive me, and I understand if you never want to come back. But I love you, and I always will. I just hope, someday, we can find a way to talk, if only for closure. I closed the email without responding. It wasn't time yet. Maybe it never would be. For now, my focus was on rebuilding myself, one small step at a time. Grace's words were a reminder of what had been lost, but they no longer felt like chains holding me back. Slowly but surely, I was learning to move forward, even if the path ahead was still uncertain. It's been 6 months since I walked out of the house I once called home. Looking back, it feels like a lifetime ago, like I'm a different person now, shaped by experiences I never saw coming. The pain of Grace's betrayal hasn't completely disappeared, but it's dulled over time, fading into something I can live with instead of something that defines me. After a lot of soul-searching, I finally met with Grace a few weeks ago. We sat across from each other in a quiet coffee shop, the conversation cautious and measured. She looked different, tired, maybe, but also calmer, like she'd done some growing of her own. She told me about the therapy she'd been going to and how it had forced her to confront not only her choices but the reasons behind them. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said, her voice steady but filled with sadness. "But I wanted to apologize in person. You deserved better than what I gave you." I nodded, appreciating her honesty but knowing it didn't change what had happened. "I've forgiven you," I said, surprising myself with the truth of the words. "Not for your sake, but for mine. Carrying all that anger around, it was eating me alive. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting, but it means I can move forward." We talked for a while longer, not about reconciliation but about closure. By the time we parted ways, I felt lighter, as if a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying had finally been lifted. Grace and I weren't meant to be together anymore, but I hoped we'd both find peace in the paths we were now walking separately. These days, I've started to rebuild my life in ways that feel meaningful. I moved into a new apartment, a space that's entirely my own, filled with things that reflect who I am now rather than who I was when I was married. I've reconnected with old friends, taken up hobbies I'd forgotten I loved, and even started dating again, not with the desperation of someone trying to fill a void, but with the cautious optimism of someone who knows what he's worth. What I've learned from all of this is that betrayal doesn't have to define you. It hurts, it cuts deep, but it also reveals truths about yourself and your relationships that you might not have seen otherwise. I've learned the importance of communication, of addressing problems head-on instead of letting them fester. I've learned that trust, once broken, is almost impossible to rebuild, and that sometimes, walking away is the best thing you can do for your own well-being. Most importantly, I've learned that self-respect isn't negotiable. Grace's actions were her own, but my choice to leave was mine, and it was the right one. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary for me to start healing, to reclaim my sense of self, and to build a future I could feel proud of. If there's one piece of advice I'd give to anyone going through something similar, it's this: don't ignore the signs. Trust your instincts, but also trust yourself to handle whatever truth you uncover. And remember, no matter how broken you feel in the moment, you're stronger than you think. Healing takes time, but it's possible, one step, one day, one decision at a time. As for me, I'm still on that journey. I'm not fully healed, and I don't know when, or if, that day will come. But I'm okay with that. For now, I'm learning to find joy in the little things, to embrace the uncertainty of what comes next, and to believe in the possibility of happiness, even after everything. And for the first time in a long time, that feels like enough.